So Kim has asked me to give a primer on ACT to probably the 30 people in the world that least need it. This is kind of a daunting task, but I think Kim was right that it's a really good idea to go through the sort of basic structure and some of the history of the theory. Because, there are probably some people in the room that haven't read, depending on your era, Understanding Events or Expressive Order or Surveying Cultures or whatever, since they were in graduate school. And for some of us, graduate school was a long time ago. It's a good idea probably to all get on the same page here at the beginning. I'm going to try to make this overview a bit more interesting by including some of the history of affect control theory, some of the personal history, because one of the advantages of getting older is that you've actually lived a lot of history. And I realized since they couldn't make it in person to this meeting, I'm the person who's probably lived the most history of affect control theory. Neil would be my only real rival, and when he came to UNC as a senior scholar, I think I had already been there for at least a year, maybe 2 years, and
you were finishing your dissertation.
Okay, then I've been there for 3 years. So I'm the oldest ACTer in the room. So I'll be throwing in some of that. I'm also going to try to highlight some of the issues and theoretical questions that are kind of implicit in the structure of the theory that we tend to kind of gloss over and pretend like we all agree on, or maybe we haven't really made a decision about, but that we might want to actually concentrate our mind on and discuss. So that's why I'm going to try to make it interesting. It is nice to be able to have a group that I can freely use the terms ACT, EPA, ABO, the whole 9 yards. I keep trying to get people to cut those out of writing because it increases the cognitive load. But here I think we can get away with it. Okay, let's start with ancient history and think about the intellectual terrain in which Dave was actually developing affect control theory and the kinds of questions it was really designed to answer. It may be really hard for those of you who are younger to believe, but in the 1950s and 60s, sociology had really coalesced around a common theoretical paradigm. There's this belief that sociology was going to be as unified in its theoretical paradigm as, for example, economics is these days. And that paradigm was Talcott Parsons' structural functionalism, which basically said, in a sentence or two, that societal structures evolve to fulfill necessary societal functions. So if it is, that means that it's functional, and you can see how this kind of came out of the 50s, and it's doing something worthwhile. And so what role do people have in this enterprise? Well, people are trained to internalize the norms of that structure and do their part in fulfilling expectations. Now, even at the time, people recognized that this wasn't completely going to fly. There's a very famous classic article by Dennis Wrong who talks about the over-socialized view of man, but it might give you a sense of how staid and stable things were, that he actually reached out to psychoanalytic theory to try to get some dynamic processual input into this sort of thing. In psychology, the dominant question was really, well, okay, we do this great job of measuring attitudes. How come they don't predict anything? How come they don't predict what people actually do? And so the big question that Dave confronted when he was working on these things was, first of all, how does an orderly society exist when it's real people who continually regenerate that order through their personal actions? But, so that's the Parsons kind of question, how's everything stable and orderly? But how do things not break down completely? when they're trying to deal with something that's unusual. You know, life is not completely paint by the numbers. How do people respond to new circumstances and unclear situations? How do they repair misunderstandings that happen when things don't work totally smoothly? So Dave wasn't the only person who was trying to answer these questions. Shel Stryker, McCall, and Simmons were all doing major things. Even the Iowa School, Thomas Kuhn a little earlier. And there were people who just gave up. Bloomer and the processual symbolic interactionists sort of said, you know, I don't think we can do this science stuff at all. Let's just have sensitizing concepts and go out and observe reality. But Dave was thinking seriously about this theoretical question, and his answer to it had 4 parts. Now, this is the way I usually describe affect control theory to a group of people who don't already know it. There are 4 parts to the theory. One is that you define a situation that calls up a set of cultural sentiments about how good, powerful, and lively the cultural elements are, the identities, the actions that you observe, the settings, or whatever. Then things happen, usually to maintain those meanings, but anything that happens gets processed with impression change, and then the control principle says that things come back together. And I usually talk about that in terms of the literature from which they developed. You know, Mead and the old symbolic interactionists is the defining the situation part. The cultural sentiments came from the psycholinguistic literature that Osgood and his colleague had. Harry Golub at the University of Denver developed the impression change paradigm. And then Powers developed the control system in '73, and Dave took all those pieces, put it together, and that's affect control theory. The trouble is, in expressive order and some other discussions that I had with Dave, I realized that he started giving talks on affect control theory in '71. And '71 is before '73. So I said, hey, there's something wrong with this picture. And so I actually asked him fairly recently and said, okay, how about, you know, what's happening here that you were actually talking? And so he shared a couple of memories with me. And both of them were at the library in the University of Chicago. So in the first, he was sitting, working on the readings for Elijah Katz's class in graduate school at the University of Chicago. And as many of you may have found, sometimes your mind strays from the readings you're supposed to be reading. And he started doodling out a little diagram that basically showed that, well, you know, there are these norms out there. Remember, this is the Talcott Parson. Norms were everything. And if reality was close to the norms, then everything was trundling along quite nicely. And the further reality got away from the norm, the weirder and screwier things got. And the group had to get things back in line. So he was actually thinking about the control system first. But he couldn't quite figure out, okay, what is this reality thing? What is the dimension on which things are getting further away and closer? And so, another time when he's just hanging out in the stacks, doing work for Edward Schill's course, he gets bored and starts wandering around the stacks, and he sees this book called The Measurement of Meaning. So, there's a story here. Give your book a good title. So he says, Measurement of Meaning? How cool is that? So he literally pulls the book down, reads about EPA, and says, obviously, EPA is it. That's reality. That's what moves. And so his dissertation, you know, is actually a compendium of EPA meanings. And he did some early monographs that were analyzing meanings in different ways, mostly published in the psych literature. And then, when he was an assistant professor, he literally saw Golub's first article on impression change. And he had an article published the next year that used impression change in a social context and started expanding it out to the EPA dimensions. So it was actually the control thing that came first. And he said that the only reason Powers really came into it is that when Powers came out, he said, that's all that stuff I've been working on, sort of developing from scratch without any background. Powers knows it, and so he used that as a citation. Okay, now let's go back to those 4 elements, because they are still the core 4 elements of the theory. So let's talk about definition of the situation and the labeling. I thought one of the useful ways to do this was to talk about the scope conditions for the theory that Dawn Robinson developed in 2008 and that have been repeated a couple of times since, a couple of times in a chapter that she and I did for Burke's book, another thing in a publication with, is it Chris Moore? No, Daniel? No, Brian. Okay. Anyway, so they've got a publication coming out that talks to them too. Anyway, for those of you who are not steeped in the Stanford School, basically the scope conditions are the conditions under which the logic of the theory applies, and therefore the range of conditions under which its predictions can reasonably be tested. Is that Dawn's more into the Stanford School than I am, but yeah, so that's what these are. So the idea of the scope conditions is that there is a directed social behavior, that is, an actor does something to an object, A, B, O, that could be self-directed in the sense that the actor and the object could be the same person. There's at least one observer who's a member of an identified language community. That is, there is a set of EPA meanings, cultural sentiments, that can be imported into the social situation as a result of that observation. The observer can be an outsider or the actor or the object. And that the theory applies only to labeled aspects of the social experience. So it doesn't apply to startle responses and things like that. It only applies to things that you process in a labeled way. Now, there have been some recent advances in definition of situation after quite a bit of neglect. It's really a part of the theory that we originally pretty much took for granted. It was part of the sort of fabric of background sociology because of the symbolic interactionist input into social psychology and sociology. But we pretty soon, if you look at that, if you look back at Understanding Events, I think there's like 4 pages on definition of the situation. If you look at our, what we call the Orange Book, the Analyzing Social Interaction from the early 80s, I think we spent 3 pages on definition of a situation. I mean, it's almost nothing. But then, as we move into current day stuff, we're finally starting to pay attention because Neil and Dave's book on the self, identities, and social institutions, actually you could argue that the whole first half of that book is about institutions and how we go about defining situations and things like that. So we're getting better, but it's an area that still needs a lot of work. But anyway, we originally kind of took it for granted, but Interact kind of knocked us over the head, showing that we couldn't, because you ended up with all sorts of totally weird predictions like doctors nuzzling patients and things like that. So we said, okay, we got to do something here. And what Dave did at that point was to develop sort of an ad hoc categorization of saying that certain identities and behaviors were relevant for certain institutions, and if you wanted to have a better set of Interact results, you could say, okay, I'm just dealing with the legal institution. And it would only give you the options of identities and behaviors that were appropriate within that institutional context. So it was ad hoc and really meant just to improve our results, but it was an acknowledgement that institutions mattered. Now, Neil and Dave have developed a much more elaborate institutional theory and cultural theory of people, and an empirical way to isolate institutions. There are lots of other interesting patterns of work that are going on here that Neil's probably going to talk a lot about in the future of affect control theory in his talk, and that we'll hear a lot more about in the next couple of days. But basically, there are people that are seriously working on how institutional coherence influences our perceived likelihood, or different ways of measuring that. Also, people interested in how the variance of EPA or impression formation or things like that might be influenced by how institutionalized something is. Just again, for the history kind of thing, this is a picture out of the Orange Book, and I wanted to contrast it. So this is, you probably can't read, this is people on an airplane. So it's, they used to talk about definition of situation very much in a sort of Barker and Wright sort of ecological sense of, okay, I'm in this room here at Dartmouth. It's on a college campus, and I'm looking around. What's going on? Oh, I'm standing up. I must be the speaker. And you're sitting down. You must be the audience. And then, I look around and it's they're known colleagues and things like that. So it starts with a place, and then he says, those in uniform, passengers, travelers, subsidized, vacationers, people visiting, business people, people in uniform, airline employees, crew members, airport employees, maintenance people, ticketing, flight crew, stewards, pilot, and that kind of thing. So it's all down. If you look, I actually scanned a picture out of the Self book and forgot to put it in the talk, but they go up. They say, okay, if I'm a mother, there's a logical implication that then I'm a parent. And then if I'm a parent, that means that I'm a family member. And if I'm a family member, that means I'm a person, and so on. So it's a really different way of doing it. So it's an interesting continuing problem for us. But there's some questions that I specifically want to raise for our consideration as we sit around and talk about affect control theory in the next few days. One is the situations need to be consciously labeled. I actually started thinking about this by sort of juxtaposing the scope conditions that Don and Brian have been talking about with a question that came up in identity theory about whether identities are always conscious. And it also kind of ties into the Bazak work. So if my distribution of identities right now is clumped on speaker, because I am standing up and talking, but I've also got this woman lumped down here. And so am I consciously being a woman? Or is that just kind of a master identity that's playing out in the background? But if I do something that makes me very unwomanly, would it bother me? Unconscious, anyway, is it conscious or not? Or what happens in the situation like that Tobias and Jesse and Kim were talking about, when we really don't know what's going on at all at first, and we develop identities through interaction? At what point do they become conscious and get a hard label? Some other questions about the variance issues, and I won't go into those much because I think some of our other presentations will do that. Okay. So we're past one part of the theory. Now, how am I doing on time? Late, as always. Okay, cultural sentiments. The good old EPA. Probably this is the part that most people understand the best. The core importance of evaluation of potency and activity is that it allowed Dave and the theory to map all of the elements into a core set of dimensions, which allows us then to operate on them mathematically, allows computer programmers to program with them, and so on. Incredibly important. As those of you try to push the theory to add more dimensions and more elements and talk about things like institutions and things like that, you might consider how important that ability to map everything into a core set of dimensions is. You're giving up something really important when you give up that simplicity. There's a long history of that, of course. There's the original work by Osgood, and Dave has scanned some of those dictionaries. Somebody needs to do some incredibly neat work with Osgood's old dictionaries. Could be amazing stuff. There's some great old data sets. Dave's dissertation, the Sewell and Heiss data on race, which were actually data from the 1970s. the 1978 compendium that Dave put together of all of the EPA stuff. There's some really cool stuff out there. The dimensions, of course, are evaluation, good or bad, potency, powerful and weak, activity, young, fast and slow, quiet, old. And they're related to things like status and power and expressiveness. Oh, I didn't know. This is from Daniel's job talk, and I put it in because I think it's a great example of the cultural meanings of some core things. And it's way more colorful than any of my slides. I didn't know it had steps to it. Yeah. So, okay, the steps are over. Anyway, get the sense of how these meanings vary culturally. So a hero's high on EP and A's, deadbeat ads down on all of them. Daniel, you probably have more important things to say about this. Anyway, there's been a lot of work over time on evaluation, potency, and activity. We've got dictionaries for the United States that range from, well, the earlier ones that Dave put together, and then big ones starting in '78 all the way up through University of Georgia and MTurk dictionaries that we just collected in the last few years that get a much larger sample. We've got dictionaries from Northern Ireland. That was collected by Dennis Willigan, a Jesuit priest who was an early student of Dave's, even before I came along. And it's got lots of really cool religious identities that somebody should probably do some interesting analysis of. We've got Canada at multiple points in time, Japan, China, South Korea, Germany at multiple points in time. So we've got a lot of different things. There was a flurry of Morocco and Egypt. I don't know why they aren't on there. Back about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, there was a flurry of investigations that were all sort of structured around the question, does structural position influence cultural sentiments? Basically, you put together a big network structural intellectual tradition and the EPA tradition, and that's the question you get. So Alison Weisskopf's dissertation looked at that. Kim's dissertation, part of Kim's dissertation looked at it. And the great German team looked at it in some major publications. Kate's work looks at it in various ways, mostly focused on gender. And if I had to summarize in a sentence the findings of those things, is that for some concepts, in some instances, structural position does make a difference in your meanings, but most of the time, for most institutionalized concepts, it really doesn't. It's the degree of consensus there is really striking to me. And as usual, Dave knew that all along. This is a figure from Surveying Cultures, and here he has the cultural norm at the top, influencing people's sentiments, which can be influenced by other things about their life. And those things can be correlated, like women may be closer together than they are to men, or upper class people may be closer together than lower class people. But basically the main line here is that sentiments, which then influences their rating, and we then average those. Notice that these errors are not correlated. That's a strong assumption. We can't measure things about which there's been a big mutual deflection. And that leads to norm measurement. So it is the understanding that these EPA values are cultural in nature and largely shared. That's what allows us to average them, to create EPA dictionaries, to use in simulations, and to produce theoretical predictions. Now, so that assumption that they're cultural and shared is necessary to our whole dictionary structure and using that part of the theory to produce predictions that we then test in experiments and things like that. But because of the work that Neil did in sort of moving affect control theory closer to Mead's classic work in symbolic interaction in his first book on affect control theory, we also tend to treat these EPA values as internalized individual meanings. That's the part here. But I'll just kind of throw out for warning and discussion. Several of us have started talking more about affect control theory as importing cultural meanings into local interactions, rather than emphasizing the internalized nature of the EPA meanings. And I at least came to that for a couple of different reasons. One is that when I taught affect control theory to people of color, I would always get this pushback and sort of say, okay, you know, you're talking about the interactions between a master and a slave. Don't tell me that that slave has internalized the meanings. They have internalized the meanings of slave in the larger culture, but don't tell me that that person has internalized being a slave, because I don't think they have. And so we've come to move a little bit away from the symbolic interactionist view of internalized meanings and talk more about importing cultural meanings into social interactions. So you can know how they expect you to behave as a slave and know that what's going to happen if you don't behave in the appropriate ways, and so on. There's also the matter of the basic situational nature of affect control theory, which Dave and Neil really stressed in their book. You know, when I get stopped by a policeman, I become a traffic violator. And it's true that I've incorporated the cultural idea of traffic violator and internalized the meaning of that. But it's not like I wander around with traffic violator as a big part of my baggage all the time. It just gets pulled out very specifically in that situation. There's also a challenge that the basic measurement model puts out to us, and you see this most often in teaching undergraduates, but also in research ideas that we have. Everybody wants to measure EPAs from a single person. And this becomes especially true now that everybody's getting interested in the self-sentiments because of Neil and Dave's book. So the trouble is, if you just measure something like self-sentiments or attitudes on EPA toward a given thing, you're using a one-item measure. And you know, sociology doesn't do much with measurement theory anymore compared to what it did when I was in graduate school. But a one-item measure has a heck of a lot of error in it. And most one-item measures are not going to do it for you. So how do you ask about things in multiple ways with multiple items so you can combine them back in and get reasonable measures? You know, Amy Kroska and Sarah Harkness and some of those folks have done better jobs with simple measures of individuals on EPA than most people have. I think it's because they're studying such dramatic phenomena that they can see the signal through the noise. One other long forgotten aspect of our scales here. Everybody always asks, if you go to a presentation, why is it 4.3? Well, you know, the thing is, we used to have boxes for each one of those scale positions. And the box for infinitely was actually on the outside of the bipolar adjectives. I actually tried to find a picture of those old boxes, and I couldn't find a picture of it. There may still be one somewhere. You got one?
Yeah, it's in, if you look at the Surveyor tutorial, it's actually in the tutorial.
Oh, why didn't I ask you? Yeah.
You guys have a copy of that in your programs. So
Good. Anyway, so you'll see. You know, it used to be boxes, and then we went to sliders. But if you look back at what we got when we analyzed the check marks in boxes with successive interval scaling, which is an old measurement technique that basically made assumptions about the normal distribution of ratings over a very large number of stimuli, this is what you get. So the males who rate acts as infinitely bad actually have a rating of like -4.5. On the positive, it's only 3.8. Notice how these things are kind of smushed together. These are actually from my chapter in the Orange Book. So the deal is that these scale ratings are sort of all over the map. We applied these values after the successive interval scalings on those checkmarked boxes, and that's how we created the original dictionary in the 78 data. But we don't do that anymore. Now we have sliders. And so, is it the case that when somebody clicks here on a slider, that it's actually much closer to them clicking here than clicking here? We have no idea. And so really the 4.3 is kind of like this artificial artifact left over from successive interval scaling, but we don't actually use that stuff anymore. I don't know. So it kind of raises the interesting question of whether we should do more measurement studies, whether we should look at treating the slider data somewhat differently, whether they'll just confuse the heck out of people and make it even worse, whether we should change to endpoints of 4 and just be done with it. I don't know. Okay, third part, impression change equations. Here we have the sentiments, which are the stable fundamental sentiments, cultural meanings. We have the impressions that we get from rating something in the context of an event, and then we regress the impressions that are formed on the sentiments that we had to work with to predict how impressions change as a result of an event. Again, we use sliders. So we say, okay, imagine that a mother plays with a child. How do you think about that mother? How good is she? How powerful is she? How active is she? The event is the unit of analysis here. And we're basically trying to say is, how does thinking about mothers as a cultural entity, thinking about playing with somebody, and thinking about children translate into the impression of that mother who is playing with a child? We do regressions to do that in these ABO sentences. And we end up with stuff like this. So this happens to be the equation that was true at some point in Interact. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, this was the 91 estimation.
Yeah, this is pre-ANOVA, but post Dave's reworking it after the Orange Book. At any rate, we now, because of expressive order, have some stable language for talking about the types of terms in these impression change equations. So we have the stability term, which is that others seem good in the context of events, just like they are good in general. We have the morality term, which is the fact that what people do has implications for how they see. Dave doesn't say this, but I made it up. We have a network term, and actually I meant to highlight all three of these, because it's basically saying that who you interact with influences what we think of you. This is kind of like your mother always used to tell you, don't hang out with a bad crowd. It's not going to be good for you. Then there are consistency terms, which are interactions within the same dimension. The most famous one, of course, is BOE, which is the sort of traditional Heideggian balance that you seem nicer if you do good things to nice people or bad things to bad people, and doing good things to nasty people or bad things to good people will really get you in trouble. Then there are congruency terms, which are interactions across dimensions. And there you basically have that people seem nicer. These are the two big ones. These are the sort of just world ones, which are the ones I like the best. Unfortunately, they pop in and out a little bit more than the BOE term does. But basically, people seem nicer when they do good things to weak others, or when they stand up to powerful others. and they do weak or gentle things to good people. So these things kind of make sense. Since 1978, elaborating and re-estimating the impression formation equations has been, I'd say, a major cottage industry. We have multiple measurements for US, we've got measurements for Canada, Japan, China, Germany, and now Egypt and Morocco, which Don's going to talk about just after me. We've got one repeat measure looking at the UNC 78 and the Duke 10 data, which Kim is analyzing. I think that's the only repeat data, isn't it?
What's the error?
Hmm?
You mean in-person design?
No, I mean repeated at two different historic periods of time.
Oh.
Yeah. And there have been some important new methodological advances, and this is probably really important that everybody know, in case you're interested in doing this kind of work. Dave did a paper that looked at ANOVA estimates of impression formation, and then Kim, John, and an undergraduate student of mine, Mao Hu, did a paper that came out in SPQ just last year that basically showed that a Bayesian analysis, now this is Bayesian statistical analysis, which is different from what Jesse is going to talk about, but related, but it actually gives us the best model of what impression change actually looks like. The interesting thing here is that you sort of say, okay, if we were this wrong about how to estimate impression formation, what basically both Dave and John and Kim and Mal show is that the way that we used to do it with a stepwise regression really leaves in a lot of garbage terms, makes a lot of false positives, and tends to emphasize the differences between groups because there's so many garbage terms. If it was so bad, how did we do so well for so long? And the deal is that in Interact, all that matters is for you to get a good approximation of the new impression as a result of the act. It doesn't matter whether your equation's right or not. And so the deal is that these methodological advances are incredibly important for actually understanding impression change, which I think is an interesting topic in and of itself. And it's very important for comparing cultures and genders and things like that, because you don't want to be wrong about differences. But Interact is actually pretty good all along. We've also, in a lot of our recent work, have really found out that the biggest moving part in predicting behavior and in predicting cultural differences in behavior and things like that is the EPA sentiments, the cultural sentiments. Way more important than the form of the equations. So that's, I guess, news you can use. So it depends on whether you want substance or not. If you want to substantively study impression change, be sure to read that SPQ paper that came out in 2016. Otherwise, just use the version of Interact that happens to work at the time. Okay, the last part of the model is the control principle. The idea that what people are really trying to do is to take that impression that is formed as a result of an event and bring it back into line with the cultural sentiments that are evoked by the labels in the situation, and that they're going to do that primarily through action, if they can, failing that through labeling or other kinds of reinterpretation. The nice thing, 3 dimensions, right, is that you can represent that distance, which we call deflection, as a mathematical entity, and then mathematically try to minimize it, which basically is what gives us the predictions that we use as theoretical predictions. Basically, the deflections minimized to create the 3-number profile that is the best behavior, or the best label, and then Interact just looks it up in the dictionary to tell you what is happening. Okay, for those of you who code, I know we've got a couple of talented computer scientists, actually more than a couple now, that's great, just to give you some sense. So that entire structure of affect control theory, as well as the emotions part that I'm going to talk about next, was all in a simulation program that fit in an 8K Commodore PET in 1978. So I don't know how big your current programs are, but 8K used to be able to do everything that was affect control theory. The basic structure of the theory was there. I had a portable computer that was a Commodore 8K, basically it's that thing that folded together, looked just like a sewing machine, which as a woman carrying it around on airplanes, people always just thought I was carrying a sewing machine. 8K! I mean, there's probably nobody who has a wristwatch out here today that has less than 8K in it. And that's what Dave got all of the original Interact in. This was a cassette tape player. That tells the actual data. Cassette tapes. Okay, there have been lots of empirical validation studies of the control principle using lots of different methods. I think that's one of the big strengths. I'm not going to go through those. But so with all of those validation studies that have already been done, what's left to do? I mean, you know, we know it works, right? Well, these are some questions that keep me up at night. I don't know about you. Okay, so exactly what is deflection? What is that distance? What is that dislocation? Okay, we know it's not emotion. Emotion is something much more complicated, which I'll deal with in just a minute. Some of the other identity control theories, like identity control theory, argue that it's stress and that it can cause mental health problems. Maybe it is, but the idea that deflection in our theory is stress doesn't quite seem to work either. It's sort of a sense of unreality, a sense that things aren't working right as we expected them to. How do we ask about it? Asking people, well, how's your reflection doing right now, Daniel? Yeah, that's not going to work. So anyway, there's some new work going on about that, which I'm very, very interested in. Also, in the control models, it's amazing how often we just resort to evaluation. It's so easy to deflect evaluation. It's, you know, the equations are better for evaluation. Everything is better for evaluation. Measurement's better. People know what evaluation is. We aren't a theory just about evaluation. If we only need one dimension, we should say it and be done with it. We've got 3 dimensions, and so a lot more things should happen with potency and activity. Furthermore, there are lots of problems with running experiments to test and affect control theory and the control principle. This business about being in a labeled universe makes it hard because you've got to make sure that everybody's dealing with the same leveled universe. If you're trying to deflect people or put them in identities, you've got to know which of the 2 you're doing, which I once wrote a grant proposal and did a whole set of experiments that totally screwed up because of that. You've got to constrain the alternatives for resolving deflection because ACT has so many different ways that you can resolve deflection. If you can't constrain that in some way, it's hard to get away from. The easiest way is just to give people vignettes and have them respond to that labeled situation that you described to them. The vignettes really do it for us. Jess Collette has a study showing that in some areas, vignettes really aren't the same thing as predicting actual behavior. You know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, I actually have a whole additional section on emotions, which I would like to talk about, but I actually see that I'm out of time, right? I'm supposed to, Lynn?
You have 9 minutes.
Okay, 9 minutes. Okay, I was going to actually stop early because, you know, I don't want to go over. But okay, I'll go through emotion really quickly. Of the advances that happened in affect control theory when I was in graduate school, when many of these themes started, the EPA studies, the that is the dictionary studies, the impression change studies, elaborating the theory for settings and things like that. The one that really made the most impact is the amalgamation equations. Attribution theory was a big, hairy deal in psychology at the time, and so the equations actually started primarily as an exploration of attribution theory. But Chris Averitt designed in having a set of modifiers that were characteristics of people, like gender and race and other kinds of stable characteristics, traits that they could acquire or be labeled with, and then emotions. And they were all included in what Dave called the amalgamation equations, which was one of my least favorite words in the theory for a long time. But Dave usually does this for a reason. Try to think of a better word that actually encompasses all of those processes. I challenge you. It's actually pretty hard. So this is basically impression change, only with just two elements. You have a modifier, angry. You have an identity, mother. And you try to predict what people think of an angry mother. And you end up getting equations like this. These are the equations from Heiss and Thomas. They actually include some interaction terms, which makes them considerably messier than the equations that we had in the orange book. Now, the neat thing about these equations that predict the composites, the angry mother, and a lot of other combinations, from the modifiers and from the identities, is that you can move the modifier out. So you can just do simple math, probably third grade math, and solve for the modifier, which means that you can say, okay, given a transient impression, given a composite that results, a hypothetical composite that results from an event, what modifier would help you understand why that thing is over there rather than at its cultural place? So if mother hits her child and she goes down in evaluation and potency, what trait, what characteristic, or what emotion would represent that new meaning, the composite meaning that she has now in the situation? You can solve for that. Okay, then you can get even more inventive. And you can substitute. Remember, we have equations. I won't flip back, but remember those big equations that predict what that impression is? You can take that big, nasty thing and substitute it in for all these C's. And then, of course, you can knock things out and do all kinds of math with that. Okay, the interesting thing is that when you do that, you come up with an emotions module and a model for attributing traits. The characteristics are mainly useful for saying, okay, this isn't a normal professor, this is a dull professor, or this is a brilliant professor, or whatever. That's a new cultural sentiment that you want to maintain. But the more interesting parts of it are the emotions and the labeled characteristics might help you interpret what happened. And in the orange book, Dave does some mathematical maneuvering with that equation and comes to a summary that looks something like this for the evaluation dimension. And basically what it shows is that the modifier, or let's just stick with emotion for the moment, is a function on the evaluation dimension of the transient impression that you have after an event's happened and the deflection, the transient minus the fundamental. So emotions and traits are a function of the transient impression that you have of somebody's evaluation after an event and the direction and extent of their movement. And we also have a neat terminology now that expresses different kinds of emotions. So characteristic emotions are the emotions that you get if you're actually maintaining an identity and everything's going right. So if I'm a professor, and all of my interactions with all kinds of different people, students, colleagues, conference attendees, everything is maintaining my identity as a professor. The emotion that I feel is my characteristic emotion that goes with being a professor. Pretty good one. Structural emotions are the emotions that are associated with maintaining an identity with a particular role alter. So maintaining the identity of professor in interactions with students are slightly different from maintaining professor everywhere. And that's a structural emotion. Situated emotions, which are the ones we usually like the most and study the most, are the emotional responses from something that isn't perfectly maintaining. So, if you all boo me when I get done, then that will be a striking event, colleagues boo colleague. And that will move me downward, and I will be expected to experience an emotion. Now, the interesting thing about our emotions module is, first of all, that it doesn't do a very good job. This thing needs some work. But there's some very clear things about what we predict, which is that who you are, in my case a professor, determines what you feel, and that an actor is always feeling some emotion. That is, it's not the case that when everything's going swimmingly, I experience no emotion. Now, Dave kind of muddied the waters here by including the term no emotion in the last Indiana US dictionary. So he actually had people rate no emotion. And it turns out to have a pretty neutral thing. So no emotion is now an emotion. But the deal is, if you solve for the emotion in affect control theory, you always find a 3-number profile. You never find blanks. So you're always experiencing some emotion. The other super important thing is that disconfirming identities does not necessarily lead to negative emotion. I mean, you all could stand up and applaud when I finish. And that would be pretty odd. But I can live with it. And it would reflect me positively. And that would be a disconfirming act for my identity as speaker. It would not be expected, would not be normal, but it would be an emotion that was positive and empowering. So, identity theory, as in Birkenstedt's, says that disconfirming identities leads to negative emotion. We do not say that. Pretty much all of our data and their data on the evaluation dimension shows that we're right. One exception to that, which we need to work on. One study that Burke did. What is that? Burke and Herod, yeah. Okay, secondly, notice that emotion and deflection are not the same thing. This is deflection. This is emotion, at least on the evaluation dimension. So we often slip into the habit of talking about emotion and deflection as if they're the same thing. They aren't mathematically. And remember, the math is the theory. And so there's some questions about emotions as well. Why are we so fixated on evaluation? Because it's easy to measure, because it's easy to theorize about. But we've got a 3-dimensional theory. Don was pointing out to me yesterday that the psychologists actually care more about activation these days. That's where their literature is. So we should probably do that. Measurement of emotion is really hard. Again, Dawn's one of the leaders, and her students are one of the leaders in this domain, trying lots of unobtrusive ways to measure emotion. You've always got to measure it first, because anything you do changes it. It's difficult. Again, if we think that deflection and emotion are two different things, maybe we should study them together and measure them at the same time and show that they're different and that they respond differently to events on a concept. What's going on in Interact when it so frequently these days, it seems like, says that there are no emotions in range? And notice how confusing it is that now that there is an emotion called no emotion, you've got 2 different kinds of things you can get as a result of an event. You can get that you experience no emotion, which is basically a very neutral EPA value, or you can get the much more common no emotions within range, which means that the EPA profile is outside of the range that the dictionary has measured emotion terms. Very confusing and basically a symptom of the fact that something seems to be wrong with this. And then finally, the thing that I'm really excited about studying, I'm going to put on my note card for the third day, is what are the implications of our new Bayesian model, which has different identities operating and developing through interaction, for our experience of emotions. Maybe it's ambitious to move on to that when the emotions module is already kind of a mess, but it's still the thing that I'm interested in right now, primarily because I got to give a talk at ISRI in a month, and so I'd like to figure something out about emotions. Anyway, thank you very much.